Welcome to qnawire.
So in this question, we have the cam, and then we also have the rod. So now in this question, the cam rotates with constant angular velocity. Okay, so this is constant. Okay, and then we need to determine the velocity of rod R for any angle theta of cam C. Okay, so in this case, the position coordinate equation okay, the origin is at O, point O, which is here. Okay, so the position coordinate equation, we want the position coordinates of A, yeah, because the velocity of R is the same as the velocity of point A. Okay, the point A is the center of this small roller. Okay, so the x coordinate of A can be determined using the law of cosines. Okay, because over here we have a triangle. So this is x, and then yeah, so say this is the point no. So say this is with this angle theta, and then this is R1. Okay, and then over here this is R1 plus R2. Okay, so the triangle that we are looking at is this blue triangle. Okay, and drawn over here. Okay, so x can be obtained using the law of cosines. So for example, not say for example, but so the law of cosine says that r1 plus r2 square will be equal to r1 square plus x square minus 2r1x cosine theta. Okay, then if we take the time derivative, of the equation, okay, so we have 0 equals to 0 plus 2x x dot minus 2r1 x dot cosine theta minus 2r1x plus sine theta theta dot. Okay, yeah, because if you differentiate cosine theta, you get minus sine theta, so this is what you get. Okay, then if you rearrange, so we know that so with x dot equals to v, theta dot equals to omega. Okay, so if you rearrange this, this is what you get. You have v equals to x r1 omega sine theta divided by r1 cosine theta minus x. Okay, so yeah, but we still need to replace x. Okay, so to replace x, we'll look at this equation. We'll look at this equation. To get x, we need to replace x in this term. So so from 1, okay, if you look at this, so we have a quadratic equation in x, okay, x squared and r1x. So this is what we have, x squared minus 2x r1 cosine theta plus r1 squared minus r1 squared plus r1 plus r2 squared. Okay, and this is equal to 0. So we use the quadratic formula. So x will be 2r1 cosine theta plus minus 2r1 cosine theta whole thing square minus 4 times r1 square minus r1 plus r2 square. Okay, and then square root, and then divide by 2. Okay, so over here, there's a 2 square, there's a 4, so this 4 and 4 can be factored out to give a 2. So you have r1 cosine theta plus minus r1 cosine theta square minus r1 square plus r1 plus r2 square. Okay, so if we simplify further, so this is what we have, r1 cosine theta plus minus r1 square cosine square theta. So this minus r1 square will cancel one of the r1 square inside here. Then you are left with 2r1 r2 plus r2 square. Okay. So this is good enough. Then we are going to take the positive root. Okay, so we are going to put x equals to r1 cosine theta plus square root of r1 square cosine square theta plus 2r1 r2 plus r2 square. Okay, then we have v equals to look back up here, we have two things to, we have x r1 omega cosine theta divided by r1 cosine theta minus x. So then when you put x inside, so you have r1 omega cosine theta r1 cosine theta plus r1 square cosine square theta plus 2r1 r2 plus r2 square divided by negative square root r1 square cosine square theta plus 2r1 r2 plus r2 square. Okay, then we continue the algebra. So we can take out the minus sign. Okay, and then you see that there's this term which is the same as the denominator. So you are going to get r1 omega cosine theta as the first term plus this r1 square cosine square theta omega divided by the square root of r1 square cosine square theta plus 2r1 r2 plus r2 square. Okay, or if you want it to be neater, you can continue to simplify further by taking out the r1 omega cosine theta by not multiplying into the bracket. Then this is what you get: 1 plus r1 cosine theta divided by r1 square cosine square theta plus 2r1 r2 plus r2 square. Okay, so this is our final answer for velocity in terms of theta. Okay, so we see that the velocity is negative. Okay, so which means that it is opposite direction to that of positive x. Okay. Okay, so that's all for this question.